Hello everyone, I am Blake Shamblin, and this is Static versus Dynamic Stretching and Improving Flexibility. Now, many of you are athletes, and for those of you who are not, this information is still very relevant. Increased flexibility has been shown to mitigate injury risk, not just sports, but everyday life. Slipping and falling, taking a nasty hit on the football field, and really anything in between, some increased flexibility could be the difference between broken hand, torn shoulder, or getting right back up again. To get that increased flexibility, however, there is not a true consensus in the fitness field of what stretching method is better. Now, when it comes to stretching, there are two main forms right now. There is static stretching and there is dynamic stretching. Dynamic stretching is going to be more active. Think some lunges where it involves more muscles at once. While static stretching is going to be stationary and involve really just isolating one muscle. Think touching your toes. Now in this study, I wanted to see which of these, if either, is better at increasing range of motion and in turn flexibility, mitigating injury risk. Now I said before, there was not a consensus on which routine is better. However, static is the more conventional routine. It's been done for a much longer time, with dynamic being a lot newer. However, despite this, there are studies that do support both. Now, this lack of academic consensus does create a crossroads where many people will choose one routine not knowing any potential benefits they are losing or gaining. Now, not knowing how to increase this flexibility and the involved consequential injury risk is a big problem for athletes. And as someone who's had their fair share of injuries, I can assure you that I would have done anything differently to avoid them. So, through my research, hopefully I can shine some more light in this area. Now onto my literature review. This article, which is in a key review of the effects of static and dynamic stretching on performance by David G. Benn. Now this review really just studied the whole impact of all stretching, and it actually came to some pretty specific conclusions. For example, they found that in static movements, the shorter, higher intensity static stretching was much more optimal to increase performance. Now, through that, minimizing impairments, there should be a lot more sub-maximal intensity aerobic activity, followed by these static stretches, and then including some more dynamic stretching into that with some more sport-specific stuff. This research did help me further understand the nuances of stretching, but ultimately, David just kind of recommended both stretching routines. He didn't say which one was better than another. They both serve their purposes. And a little more difference in our two studies. David wants you to perform better in your sport. I want to make sure you don't get injured. Next, we have the dynamic stretching and its sustained effects on range of motion and passive stiffness of the hamstring muscles by its lead author, Masahiro Iwata. Now, this study was really cool, and it actually did find that stretching does increase range of motion, which is conclusive evidence that is not very common on this topic. I like this article especially because of the testing method, where they took the participants similar to my study, a similar number. It was around 5 participants per group, which is actually my exact number, and then they stretched them dynamically. Now, they then tested the results in 15-minute intervals, which was a lot longer than I tested them before, and they did achieve positive results. Having this study so similar to mine was a huge help throughout the entire process, and I was able to use some of the recommendations she left at the end of her study in my own study. For example, she recommended that I stretch my participants more than once a week, which is what they did. Finally, I have the effect of time and frequency of static stretching on flexibility of the hamstring muscles by William Bandy. This study, unlike the first, purely focused on the static routine, where they did find that flexibility was altered. Now, however, the amount of difference in flexibility was most greatly altered by the frequency of the stretching routine. He also found some interesting stats, like 30 seconds being the most optimal time for a static stretch. I like this stretch because I use a control group similar to me, and a big portion of his results was comparing his experimental group to the control group, which is really the best method to get some concrete evidence in this area. Now, to my methodology. For my methodology, I used the experimental method. This was done in a 5-week-long routine where I had 3 groups being used, a control as well as a dynamic and static stretching group. They each did their individual routines that I designed, which included 5 to 7 stretches of their specific brand, dynamic stretching, static stretching, and the control group did no stretching. Once at the end of each week, I used a MFS overhead squat, which is just a PVC pipe overhead squat, to test their flexibility. And then I used a previously benchmark test to give them a score 1 to 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. Now this score was based upon, as I said previously, marked checkpoints that I designed. These marks are going to be 1, getting your arms over and behind your head during the squat. You get 0, 1, or 2 points, depending on the depth of your squat. Another point for being back in your heels for the duration of the squat. And that final 5th point for being stable in the ease of motion throughout the squat. Now, I chose to do my research this way specifically because I feel the experimental method allowed me to better test my 3 specific variables, dynamic, static, control, and overall, the experimental method was just consistent in field research. This type of data actually also allowed me to make really easy charts and graphs that can really model and kind of find any correlation that I would later discover. Now, here are the results that I got charted. The above graph represents the dynamic and stretching participants and their success with the PVC overhead squat. Each colored line represents a different participant, and the x-axis is the score they received through each of the 5 weeks respectively, with 5 participants to each study, dynamic, static, and control. There is a trend of improvement, with an average score increase of 1.4 points after 5 weeks in the dynamic group. Very similarly, the static stretching routine had an average growth rate of 1.2 points. Unfortunately, there is not strong evidence here to suggest one stretching regime triumphs over another, which at first can make this research seem lacking in discovery. However, both routines did provide better results in the control group, which is very interesting research. Now, in the control group, there was only a 0.4 point average growth rate, as compared to the over 1 whole point growth rate in the both experimental groups. This is a huge discovery, as there was really a lot of academic conversation as if stretching would increase long-term range of motion at all, let alone this kind of drastic discovery. Now, in this research, there were a couple areas in which I believe could have been further studied to bring greater light to my study. One of these involves the time which a participant performs the stretching routine in relation to workouts they also undergo. For example, in my control stretching group, participant 4 informed me that he had a rigorous workout in the past 2 hours for a separate commitment. So his body was fatigued, and this showed up in the results as his day 3 score took a significant hit. With many athletics coaches encouraging pre or post game workouts, this does bring into question their effectiveness. I believe that with more research into the optimal period of time to wait for muscles to recover before being able to operate at an effective level again would be incredible research. Secondly, in my research I found that although against the norm, there were instances where participants received a lower score than the week before, then immediately receiving a massive jump in their score. And 3 to 4 instances where participants underwent a dip in their score, they then received the highest overall score boost of any participant when compared with week 1 to week 5. In looking into this, there's a psychological effect called the extinction burst. Now, this is typically referred to in non-athletic fields, but I believe it can be applied. An extinction burst is where an individual who is attempting to stop an unwanted behavior, and this could be a huge range of things. This can be quitting an addictive substance, stop eating fast food, and I believe bad habits and workout routines. That behavior will reestablish itself and increase in intensity right before there's a breakthrough. With that knowledge, there is potential correlation between my data and this extinction burst, where the bad habits that participants were attempting to get rid of would reassert themselves, causing the dip, before they were then eradicated and leading to show mass improvement. This is a really interesting concept, and I think that it should be further studied to really take a deep dive into the extinction burst and its application into athletics. Now, I would like to note a couple caveats to my data. The inability to regulate the participants' behavior outside of the study, which might have influenced the findings, was one of the more major shortcomings. Now, for instance, those who stretched more outside of the trial may have received better outcomes. I have no way of knowing that. Physical constraints were also noted throughout the testing, as some participants performed poorly on testing day, as I mentioned earlier, the participant 4 in the control group receiving a lower score during working out, as the article 4. And finally, from a demographic standpoint, those who I tested were all males within the age range of 16 to 18, which is a narrow group. And my findings may have been different if I tested those who are younger, older, or did identify with a separate demographic. All right, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, Blake, I got a couple of questions for you, and then we will wrap this thing up.
Love to hear 'em.
So for the first one, how did your initial exploration of that scholarly conversation way back at the start of the year, how did that help to inform your research question?
So my original research question was actually, how does flexibility affect one rep maxes in weightlifting? While I was researching that, actually I had shoulder surgery. And that made me kind of look at, well, how does this whole flexibility thing work, you know? And in doing that, I found there was not really any research on how to better improve your flexibility and then your mitigation injury risk. There just wasn't information there. There was no research. So I wanted to look into that and find out, okay, how could I have avoided this? You know, which stretching routine is the best?
Excellent. As a follow-up question, how does your new understanding articulated in your conclusion address the gap in the current research?
So the gap in the research is there was no academic consensus on what's better, dynamic or static stretching. Through my research, I kind of learned that while both routines do show that they do help your flexibility, there isn't really a better one. It's more of just being active, getting your muscles involved, and stretching in some form to help you really increase that range of motion.
Okay. And then finally, for the third question, think back to the initial curiosity that first sparked your research into flexibility. With the skills you've developed, what other curiosities do you have now? Like what other things might you want to research?
So I mentioned it briefly in my results section, but the extinction burst, which I talked about, that's really an incredible concept, and there was quite literally no research on it in the athletic field. If someone were to research that and find correlation like I did, the implications of that would be massive. That would explain why those looking to get to working out quit right before they start to make a breakthrough. Explaining why athletes hit plateaus, why athletes go through a mental block. All those things can kind of be explained under that one extinction burst, which is new research.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.